At 2 p.m. on January 26, 1945, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched in a shallow drainage ditch 10 yards ahead of his defensive line, watching 6 German tanks and 250 white-suited infantry emerge from the village of Holtzwihr through the snow. The temperature hovered near 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Murphy's hands gripped a field telephone. Behind him, what remained of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, waited in positions they'd carved from frozen ground the night before. 40 men. That's all he had left. 40 men to hold a road that led straight through the Bois de Riedveer to American lines a mile back. If the Germans took this road, the entire 3rd Division position would collapse. Murphy was 19 years old. He'd been commanding Company B for less than 24 hours. The man holding that telephone line was born Audie Leon Murphy on June 20, 1925, in a sharecropper's shack near Kingston, Texas, one of 12 children, though only 9 survived past childhood. The Murphy family lived in poverty so complete that the word barely captures it. No books, no radio, a house that was more shack than structure. Audie's father, Emmett Murphy, drifted in and out of the family's life before abandoning them entirely when Audie was 10. His mother, Josie, died in 1941 when Audie was 16. He'd been supporting his siblings by picking cotton for $1 a day and hunting small game with a borrowed rifle. When his mother died, the family broke apart. The youngest children went to an orphanage. Audie took what remained of his childhood and buried it. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Murphy tried to enlist in the Marines. They rejected him. Too short, too light. 5 feet, 5.5 inches tall. 112 pounds. He tried the paratroopers. Same answer. Finally, on June 30, 1942, after his older sister signed an affidavit claiming he was 18 instead of 17, the Army took him. At basic training in Camp Walters, Texas, his company commander tried to transfer him to cook school. Murphy refused. He wanted combat. He passed out once during close order drill in the Texas heat, but he qualified as a marksman with the rifle and became an expert with the bayonet. When they shipped him to North Africa in February 1943, he weighed 112 pounds and looked like a child wearing his older brother's uniform. The problem Murphy faced at Holtzwihr was simple and absolute. Company B was supposed to hold the northern edge of the Bois de Riedveer, a massive forest that dominated the approaches to the German stronghold of Holtzwihr. The forest was strategically vital. Whoever controlled it controlled the roads leading to German positions throughout the Colmar Pocket, the last piece of French soil still occupied by Nazi forces. On January 24, 1945, the 15th Infantry Regiment had been ordered to take those woods. The day before, the 30th Infantry Regiment had tried. They'd been cut to pieces. Without cover and unable to dig foxholes in ground frozen solid, American soldiers had died in rows as German machine guns swept the open approaches. The 30th withdrew. Now, it was the 15th's turn. Company B had fought its way into the forest on January 25th through fighting so intense that by midnight, when they finally reached their assigned position 600 yards into the woods, every officer except Murphy had been killed or wounded. Of the 120 enlisted men who'd started the advance, only 18 remained combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or scattered. Murphy, who'd been a platoon leader 24 hours earlier, now commanded the company. He was the only officer left. He'd been in combat for 2 years. He'd fought in Sicily, Italy, southern France, and through the Vosges Mountains. He'd earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and a Bronze Star. He'd been wounded twice. He'd killed more enemy soldiers than he could remember. But this was different. This wasn't about attacking. This was about holding against an enemy that outnumbered his force 6-1. Murphy had called battalion headquarters that afternoon for instructions. He was told that reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, had not yet arrived. His orders were direct: hold your position. No fallback position, no reserve force, just hold. The Germans understood what that road meant as clearly as Murphy did. If they retook the forest, they could threaten the entire American advance. The infantry attacking Murphy's position belonged to the German 2nd Mountain Division, elite troops transferred from Norway specifically for this mission. They'd been training for mountain warfare their entire service. They knew how to fight in winter conditions. They knew how to use terrain. And they had armor support. 6 tanks moving up the narrow dirt road that cut through the forest. At dawn on January 26th, 2 M10 tank destroyers from Lieutenant Colonel Walter Tardy's 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion arrived to support Company B's position. Murphy positioned them carefully. One tank destroyer sat approximately 40 yards ahead of his defensive line, covering the road. The second took position at the rear of the line. Murphy set up his command post in a drainage ditch, 10 yards in front of the rear tank destroyer. He ran a field telephone line back to battalion headquarters, a mile to the rear. Company B stretched across the bottom of a U-shaped clearing, with fingers of forest on both flanks and Holtzwihr visible across snow-covered fields to the south. Murphy knew the German armor would have to use the road. The frozen ground and deep snow made off-road movement nearly impossible for tanks. When the German artillery barrage started at 1400 hours, Murphy was on the telephone with battalion headquarters, arranging fire support. He saw the counterattack forming a mile away. 6 tanks preceded by white-suited infantry, nearly invisible against the snow except for their movement. Murphy alerted his men and called for artillery fire. Then the German shells started landing. The preliminary barrage walked through Company B's positions with methodical precision. Trees exploded. Frozen earth fountained upward. The sound was continuous, overwhelming. Murphy stayed on the telephone, adjusting fire, directing the few weapons his men still had operational. The German tanks advanced down the road with infantry moving alongside and behind them. The lead tank destroyer opened fire. At that range, its 3-inch gun could penetrate German armor. The first round hit a tank but failed to disable it. The Germans returned fire. Tank shells and machine gun fire ripped through the American positions. Murphy's men fired back with everything they had, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The German infantry, veterans of Norway's mountain campaigns, moved with practiced efficiency, using terrain and suppressing fire to advance steadily. Murphy emptied his M1 carbine at the approaching infantry. He could see individual faces now, see the determination in their movements. These weren't conscripts. These were professional soldiers executing a coordinated assault. Then the forward tank destroyer took a direct hit. The explosion was catastrophic. Fuel ignited. Ammunition began cooking off inside the turret. Black smoke poured from the vehicle. The 5-man crew bailed out and ran for the tree line, leaving the tank destroyer burning on the road. Murphy watched the crew disappear into the forest. His defensive line had just lost its primary anti-tank weapon. The German tanks kept coming. Murphy could hear the grinding of their tracks, the roar of their engines. His men were starting to break. He could feel it. The volume of incoming fire was too much. His soldiers were infantrymen with rifles and a handful of machine guns facing armor and overwhelming numbers. Murphy made a decision that violated every tactical principle in the Army manual. Instead of ordering a fighting withdrawal to preserve his force, he told his men to fall back to positions deeper in the forest, while he remained forward to direct artillery fire. He stayed in the drainage ditch with the field telephone. Alone. The German tanks were 100 yards away now. Murphy could see the pennants on their radio antennas. He called fire missions, watching the shells land, adjusting coordinates. The artillery was effective. German infantry fell in clusters, but more kept coming. The tanks rolled through the barrage, impervious to everything except a direct hit. The burning tank destroyer sat 40 yards ahead of Murphy's position, flames climbing from its open turret, smoke pouring across the snow. It was a death trap. The vehicle was loaded with high-explosive ammunition and fuel. It could detonate at any second. But on top of the turret, still mounted and operational, was a Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine gun. Murphy looked at the burning vehicle. He looked at the approaching German infantry. He looked at the forest behind him where his company had taken cover. If the Germans took this position, they'd sweep through the woods and hit the American rear. His men would be encircled. The entire 3rd Division position would be compromised. Murphy climbed out of the drainage ditch and ran toward the burning tank destroyer. German machine gun fire followed him. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet, cracked past his head. He reached the tank destroyer and pulled himself up onto the burning hull. The metal was hot enough to burn through his gloves. Smoke filled his lungs. He could feel heat radiating from the engine compartment below him. He grabbed the handles of the 50 caliber machine gun and swung it toward the German infantry. The weapon was fully loaded with a 200-round ammunition belt. Murphy pressed the butterfly trigger. The gun fired with a sound like continuous thunder. Tracers reached out across the snow at 2,150 feet per second. Each round weighed half an ounce and could penetrate light armor at 1,000 yards. Against infantry, the effect was devastating. Murphy swept the gun across the advancing Germans. Bodies fell. The white winter camouflage that had made them nearly invisible now marked where they'd been hit, red spreading across white fabric. The German advance faltered. Soldiers who'd been moving steadily forward dove for cover, scrambled back, tried to find protection in terrain that offered none. Murphy kept firing. The ammunition belt fed through the gun smoothly. Empty brass casings cascaded from the ejection port, bouncing off the burning turret, falling into the snow. The gun barrel began to glow red from sustained fire. Murphy's hands burned even through his gloves, but he didn't let go. German return fire intensified. Machine guns, rifles, tank cannons, all focused on the lone figure standing on top of the burning vehicle. Rounds hit the tank destroyer's armor with metallic cracks. Others whistled past Murphy's head so close he could feel the displacement of air. A round tore through his left leg just above the knee, fragmenting bone and muscle. Murphy felt the impact but didn't stop firing. He was still holding the field telephone. Between bursts of machine gun fire, he was calling fire missions, directing artillery onto German positions, adjusting coordinates based on what he could see from his elevated position. The artillery officer on the other end asked how close the Germans were. Murphy's response entered Army legend. "Hold the phone, and I'll let you talk to one of the bastards." The artillery continued to pound German formations. Combined with Murphy's machine gun fire, it created a killing zone that the Germans couldn't cross. But they kept trying. The 2nd Mountain Division had orders to take that road. German officers pushed their men forward. Infantry advanced in short rushes, using what cover they could find. The tanks continued their approach, firing as they moved. Murphy rotated between targets, killing officers first when he could identify them, then focusing on groups of infantry. The 50 caliber gun never stopped. The tank destroyer beneath him was burning hotter. Murphy could smell fuel and melting rubber. He could feel the vehicle shaking as internal ammunition exploded in small, sympathetic detonations. The main ammunition storage was in the sponsons and rear turret, right below where he stood. If those rounds cooked off simultaneously, the entire vehicle would disintegrate in a massive explosion. Murphy would be vaporized instantly. But if he climbed down, the German infantry would overrun the position in minutes. So he stayed. He fired until the first ammunition belt ran empty, then loaded a fresh belt and continued firing. The Germans tried everything. They maneuvered infantry around both flanks, but Murphy shifted his fire to meet each threat. They brought tanks forward to engage him directly, but he fired at the infantry supporting the tanks, forcing the armor to advance without protection. He called artillery onto the tanks themselves, bracketing them with high explosive shells that couldn't destroy them, but could kill their supporting infantry and force the tank commanders to button up, limiting their visibility. The engagement continued for over an hour. German infantry got as close as 100 yards before Murphy's fire drove them back. A full squad tried to advance through a ditch similar to the one Murphy had abandoned. He saw them through the smoke, and cut them down with a sustained burst that lasted 15 seconds. The ditch became a grave. The Germans tried indirect fire, lobbing mortar rounds at Murphy's position, but the burning tank destroyer created so much smoke that their aim was poor. Rounds landed wide or short. Murphy kept firing. His wounded leg had gone numb. Blood ran down into his boot, but the cold helped slow the bleeding. His hands were burned. His face was blackened with smoke and gunpowder residue. His ears rang from the continuous noise of the .50 caliber gun. But he didn't stop. Private Brad Croker, watching from the tree line, later said Murphy was too daring for most of us. Croker said Murphy took calculated chances, stuck his neck out when others wouldn't. Another soldier described the scene as the greatest display of guts and courage I have ever seen. But from Murphy's perspective, there was no courage involved. There was only necessity. The Germans had to be stopped. The position had to be held. Everything else was irrelevant. The German attack finally broke. After an hour of continuous assault, after taking casualties that no infantry force could sustain, after watching their advance destroyed by a single man on a burning tank destroyer, the German commander ordered a withdrawal. The white-suited infantry fell back in small groups, dragging wounded, leaving dead behind. The tanks reversed, turned, and pulled back toward Holtzwihr. Murphy stayed on the burning tank destroyer until the Germans were completely out of effective range. Then he climbed down. His left leg collapsed when he tried to walk. He crawled back to his defensive position, using his rifle as a crutch, still holding the field telephone. Company B emerged from the forest. Murphy organized a counterattack immediately. Despite his wound, despite exhaustion, despite the fact that he could barely stand, he refused evacuation. The Germans might come back. The position had to be secured. His men advanced through the area where the German assault had been broken. They counted bodies. More than 50 German soldiers had been killed. Others had died from artillery fire. The snow was red for 100 yards in every direction from the tank destroyer. The telephone line back to battalion headquarters had been cut during the fighting, either by American or German artillery. But the message had already gotten through. Murphy had held the position. The road was secure. 2 hours after the German withdrawal, the burning tank destroyer finally exploded. The main ammunition storage detonated in a blast that could be heard a mile away. Fragments of the vehicle landed 50 yards from the explosion site. If Murphy had still been on top of the turret, nothing would have remained of him larger than a hand. On January 27th, the 3rd Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, reinforced by replacements, captured Holtzwihr. The Germans, demoralized by their failure to break through Murphy's position, pulled most of their forces back. By January 28th, except for small pockets of resistance, the areas east of the Ill River and north of the Colmar Canal were clear of German forces. Word of Murphy's action spread through the 3rd Infantry Division immediately. Soldiers who'd witnessed it told soldiers who hadn't. Officers at battalion and regimental headquarters heard the reports and couldn't believe them. One man, standing on a burning vehicle that could explode at any moment, had held off 6 tanks and 250 infantry for over an hour. Company commanders asked their men for details. What exactly had happened? The story was confirmed by multiple witnesses. Murphy had done exactly what the reports claimed. The division's intelligence section analyzed the engagement. They examined the German casualty count, the positions where bodies were found, the timing of the assault and withdrawal. Their conclusion was inescapable. Murphy's action had prevented a German breakthrough that would have threatened the entire division's position. His defense of that road had been tactically decisive. Other units began asking about Murphy. Who was this lieutenant? What was his combat record? The answers surprised no one who'd served with the 15th Infantry Regiment. Murphy had been in continuous combat since Sicily. He'd led men through Italy, across the beaches of southern France, through the Vosges Mountains. He'd been wounded multiple times and had earned more decorations for valor than most soldiers accumulated in an entire war. This action at Holtzwihr was extraordinary, but it was also characteristic. Murphy had a reputation for refusing to retreat, for holding positions that others thought untenable, for fighting with an intensity that bordered on suicidal. But he survived. He always survived, and his men noticed that when Murphy fought, they survived too. Within days, company commanders throughout the 3rd Division were using Murphy's action as a training example. This is how you hold a defensive position. This is how you use available weapons. This is how you fight when you're outnumbered. The lesson wasn't about heroics. The lesson was about effectiveness. Murphy had identified the key weapon available to him, the .50 caliber machine gun, and he'd used it to maximum effect. He'd combined machine gun fire with artillery support, creating overlapping fields of fire that the Germans couldn't penetrate. He'd maintained communication with headquarters throughout the engagement, ensuring that supporting fires were accurate and timely. He'd stayed calm under conditions that would have broken most men. That's what other officers wanted their men to learn. Not courage, but tactical competence under extreme stress. The effect on German forces in the Colmar pocket was significant. The 2nd Mountain Division had been one of the elite units defending the pocket. They'd been sent to take that road specifically because German commanders believed they were capable of breaking through American positions. Their failure and the casualties they'd taken had immediate strategic consequences. German commanders became more cautious. They began to doubt whether their forces could successfully attack American positions, even when they had numerical and armor superiority. That doubt slowed German operations throughout the pocket. Units that might have launched local counterattacks instead remained defensive. The psychological impact of Murphy's stand spread through German ranks just as it had spread through American ranks, but with opposite effect. On February 9, 1945, the Colmar pocket was finally eliminated. German forces were driven back across the Rhine. Alsace was liberated. The last German foothold on French soil was gone. Murphy's action at Holtzwihr had been one small engagement in that larger campaign, but it had been decisive at a critical moment. Brigadier General Ralph Lovett and Lieutenant Colonel Hallett Edson recommended Murphy for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation moved through channels slowly. The Army required extensive documentation for its highest award. Witness statements were collected. After-action reports were compiled. The tactical situation was analyzed. German casualty figures were verified. Every detail was checked and rechecked. The recommendation was approved at every level. On June 2, 1945, at a ceremony at an airfield in Salzburg, Austria, 1 month after Germany's surrender, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commanding general of the 7th Army, presented Murphy with the Medal of Honor. The citation read, in part, 2nd Lieutenant Murphy commanded Company B, which was attacked by 6 tanks and waves of infantry. 2nd Lieutenant Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to prepared positions in the woods, while he remained forward at his command post and continued to give fire directions to the artillery by telephone. Behind him, to his right, one of our tank destroyers received a direct hit and began to burn. Its crew withdrew to the woods. 2nd Lieutenant Murphy continued to direct artillery fire, which killed large numbers of the advancing enemy infantry. With the enemy tanks abreast of his position, 2nd Lieutenant Murphy climbed on the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its .50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. He was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides, but his deadly fire killed dozens of Germans and caused their infantry attack to waver. The enemy tanks, losing infantry support, began to fall back. For an hour, the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate 2nd Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position and wiped out a squad which was trying to creep up unnoticed on his right flank. Germans reached as close as 10 yards, only to be mowed down by his fire. He received a leg wound, but ignored it and continued the single-handed fight until his ammunition was exhausted. He then made his way to his company, refused medical attention, and organized the company in a counterattack, which forced the Germans to withdraw. His directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. Second Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction, and enabled it to hold the woods which had been the enemy's objective. Murphy became America's most decorated combat soldier. In addition to the Medal of Honor, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, 2 Bronze Stars with V device, 3 Purple Hearts, and numerous other awards. France awarded him the Legion of Honor and 2 Croix de Guerre medals. Belgium awarded him the Croix de Guerre. He'd killed or wounded an estimated 240 German soldiers during his combat service. He'd been wounded 3 times. He was 20 years old when the war in Europe ended. Murphy never spoke much about Holtzwihr. When asked about it later, he said he'd just been doing his job. He said any soldier in his position would have done the same thing. He said he'd been fighting to stay alive like anyone else. He dismissed suggestions that he was a hero. Bravery is just determination to do a job that you know has to be done, he told an interviewer. That's how he saw it, not as heroism, as necessity. But the men who'd watched him stand on that burning tank destroyer for over an hour, who'd seen him hold off an entire German assault force alone, who'd survived because he'd refused to retreat, they saw it differently. They knew what they'd witnessed. They knew that without Murphy's action, they'd have been overrun. They knew that the road would have fallen, the position would have collapsed, and many of them would have died. They knew that one man, standing on a vehicle that could explode at any second, had changed the outcome of the battle through sheer will and accurate fire. After the war, Murphy struggled. The Army offered him opportunities to stay in service, but he declined. He returned to civilian life, but civilian life didn't make sense anymore. He had nightmares. He couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol under his pillow. He startled at sudden noises. He avoided crowds, what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Murphy called the war inside. He self-medicated with sleeping pills and alcohol. He had violent mood swings. His first marriage fell apart. James Cagney saw Murphy's photograph on the cover of Life magazine in June 1945. The photo showed a boyish-looking soldier in uniform, chest covered with medals, looking uncomfortable with the attention. Cagney invited Murphy to Hollywood, offered him acting lessons, put him up in his home. Murphy eventually signed with Universal Pictures and began a film career that lasted 2 decades. He appeared in 44 films, mostly westerns. His best-known role was playing himself in To Hell and Back, the 1955 film adaptation of his war memoir. The movie was Universal's highest-grossing film for 20 years until Jaws broke its record. Murphy became a successful actor, but Hollywood couldn't fix what war had broken. In 1970, Murphy began speaking publicly about post-combat stress. He testified before Congress about the problems facing Vietnam veterans. He talked openly about his own struggles with nightmares, with depression, with the inability to adjust to peacetime. He called for better support for returning combat veterans. He said the government had a responsibility to help men who'd been damaged by combat. This was radical at the time. Veterans weren't supposed to admit weakness. Murphy admitted it freely. He said war had cost him more than the wounds that were visible. On May 28, 1971, Murphy died in a plane crash near Roanoke, Virginia. He was traveling to Virginia to investigate a business opportunity when the small private plane he was flying in encountered heavy fog and crashed into Brush Mountain. Murphy was 46 years old. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave receives more visitors than almost any other grave in Arlington, except for President Kennedy's. People still come to pay respects to the small Texas sharecropper's son who became America's most decorated soldier. The memorial at Holtzwihr, erected in 2000, stands at the exact location where Murphy made his stand. It's a simple marker, gray stone with bronze plaques in French and English. It shows a soldier standing atop a tank destroyer. The inscription dedicates the memorial to the soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division who liberated Holtzwihr, with special recognition of Murphy's action on January 26, 1945. French and American flags fly above the memorial. The road Murphy defended still exists. The forest is still there. The village of Holtzwihr has been rebuilt, but the ground remembers. On January 26th each year, a small ceremony is held at the memorial. French civilians and American veterans gather to remember what happened there. They remember that one man stood alone on a burning vehicle and held a position that everyone else thought was lost. The lesson of Holtzwihr isn't about individual heroism. The lesson is about the moments in war when everything depends on someone refusing to accept defeat. Murphy had every tactical justification to withdraw. His company was decimated. His support was gone. He was facing overwhelming force. Retreat was the logical choice. But Murphy understood something that transcends tactics. Some positions can't be abandoned regardless of the cost. That road had to be held. If it fell, men would die. Not just his men, but men in units behind him who were depending on Company B to anchor the defensive line. Murphy made a calculation that his life was worth less than the mission. He was willing to die on that tank destroyer if it meant holding the position long enough for reinforcements to arrive or for the German attack to break. He survived, but his willingness to die was what made survival possible. The Germans saw a man who wouldn't retreat regardless of circumstances. They couldn't break that. They couldn't kill him despite concentrated fire from multiple weapons. After an hour, they gave up trying. That's the reality of combat that Murphy understood, and that most people never will. Sometimes you hold because retreat means death for others. Sometimes you stand on a burning vehicle because it's the only position where you can effectively engage the enemy. Sometimes you fight through pain and exhaustion and fear because the alternative is worse. Murphy did those things at Holtzwihr. He did them in other engagements throughout his combat service. He did them so consistently that by war's end, he'd earned every combat decoration for valor that America could award. He never called himself a hero. He called himself a survivor. But survival, for Murphy, meant doing whatever was necessary to keep his men alive. Even if that meant standing alone on a burning tank destroyer, firing a .50 caliber machine gun at an enemy that outnumbered him 6-1, refusing to retreat until the position was secure. The burning tank destroyer at Holtzwihr represents something fundamental about human nature under extreme stress. Most people break. They can't sustain that level of danger, that level of fear, that level of physical discomfort. They find reasons to quit. Murphy didn't quit. He stood on metal that was hot enough to burn through his gloves, in smoke thick enough to choke him, with a wounded leg that should have disabled him, and he fought for over an hour against an enemy that was trying to kill him with everything they had. He didn't quit, because quitting meant his men would die. That's the calculation Murphy made. His life versus their lives, his comfort versus their survival, his fear versus their safety. He chose them. Every time. That's why they survived. That's why the position held. That's why the German attack failed. One man decided that some things were worth dying for, and he acted on that decision with absolute commitment. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.